Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nazir Daf Lamed. This month's learning is sponsored by John and Yael Cohen for Refuah Shlema for Rafael Itamar Tzvi Ben Dvorah Esther, a doctor who has healed thousands of people with his medical expertise, providing endless care and love at all hours of the day and night. May Hashem give him the same attention and grant him a full and speedy recovery. This week's learning is sponsored by Netanya Slomowitz in honor of the birth of their two newest granddaughters, Yahav Ahuva Bat Shifra and Gal Slomowitz, and Keshet Naomi Bat Sivan and Ariel Sheb. Mazal Tov. Okay, we are going to just go back to the Mishnah on Lamed Bet, 2 pages ago, which really isn't very long ago. I hope you enjoyed, all of you, the Shabbat daf. Next cycle, it will not come out on Shabbat. Okay, we had a case where there was somebody walking and one person said, I'm sure it's this person, I'm going to be a Nazir. And the other person, I'm sure it's not, I'm going to be a Nazir, and so on and so on. I'm not going to go back into all the details. Then the Mishnah had said, after it gave the 3 opinions, there was Beit Shammai, who says they're all Nazirim. Beit Hillel, who said only the ones who are right are Nazirim, although we had a bit of a debate how to exactly understand them. And then we had Rabbi Tarfon, who said no one's a Nazir. And that's because unless you take on a definitive statement of acceptance of Nazirut, you're not a Nazir. Then we had the continuation of the Mishnah where they said if the person turns around and walks away and we never identify who the person is, they're not a Nazir. And Rabbi Shimon said, no, they have to be a Nazir Misafek. Everyone has to be a Nazir Misafek because we don't really know what happened. And you basically, what you do is to be a Nazir Misafek instead of Nazir Misafek, normally that means you have to be a Nazir forever. You basically say, if that person, right, if it was really that person, or if my statement, whatever my statement was correct, then I'll be a Nazir based on my obligation. If not, I'll take upon myself a voluntary Nazirut. And that we saw was a debate to Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. We saw it a number of times already. There were a few Mishnayot like that. And we started with on Daf Chet, quoting this case in the Tosefta of, if there's 100 core in this pile, I'll be a Nazir, and then the pile gets stolen or lost. So basically what we're going to do right now is try to figure out, which is kind of obvious already, but that Hirtia Lacholav no Nazir, this opinion of Tanakama that comes before Rabbi Shimon is actually Rabbi Yehuda. To get there, the Gemara is going to say, first, Hirtia Lacholav no Nazir, and that's at the very bottom of Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph. Tama mishum te Hirtia Lacholav, ate lekaman have Nazir. It's clear from here that the reason why none of them are Nazirs is because the person disappeared. But if they were actually in front of us, and we knew who it was, somebody would be a Nazir. To which case they say mani. Now, it's not exactly because of this inference, it's because of, it's very important to understand this, it's because of the combination. That we have a case where if the person shows up and we know who it is, someone's going to be a Nazir. That was the inference. And if they're not here right now, though, and we never have a way of identifying, then no one's going to be a Nazir. So that combination is going to cause us to say exactly whose opinion does this follow. Ilema Rabbi Tarfon, if it's Rabbi Tarfon, now you would have expected they're going to say either it's Rabbi Tarfon or Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel, but that's not what they're going to say, and you'll see why in a minute. First, they start with Rabbi Tarfon, and they say it clearly can't be Rabbi Tarfon because of the inference we just made. If you want to just say the person turned around, never showed up, he's not a Nazir, if we didn't infer anything from that, we'd say maybe that's Rabbi Tarfon, because Rabbi Tarfon says none of them is a Nazir, and also in this case, none of them is a Nazir, but it's for a totally different reason, because this case, no one's a Nazir, not because no one took on a definitive statement of Nazirut like Rabbi Tarfon holds. It's because we never had a chance to identify. And that's what the inference is for, to get rid of Rabbi Tarfon. Can't possibly Rabbi Tarfon because the inference is that even though you're not a Nazir, it's only you're not a Nazir because we never got to identify who that person was. But in the event that we identified the person, one of them, right, or maybe multiple of them, depending on, right, all the statements that were made, somebody would end up a Nazir. So how could it not be Rabbi Tarfon? Because miyavi Nazir. Now, I already just explained this all to you, but we'll see. He wouldn't have been a Nazir if the guy showed up on the scene, because Kevan de Bashata de Kanazar lo yada iploni hu imlo michala alay nezirut. Because since at the time he took the neder to be a Nazir, we didn't know for sure, right? He was pretty convinced when he said it. She said it, but nobody really knew for sure. And therefore, how could the Nazirut be chal? Now, it's very interesting. You would have expected them to say, because doesn't it say in the Mishnah that Rabbi Tarfon says, Ein acha mehem Nazir, right? You would have expected them to say, because Rabbi Tarfon says in our Mishnah, none of them is a Nazir. But instead of quoting Rabbi Tarfon in our Mishnah, they quote the Tosefta where Rabbi Tarfon appears. V'hatanya Rabbi Yehuda omer mishum Rabbi Tarfon ein acha mehem Nazir, lefi shelo nitna Nazirut ela lahafla. What they quote instead is a Tosefta where Rabbi Yehuda quotes Rabbi Tarfon. And he quotes Rabbi Tarfon as saying that none of them is a Nazir because lo nitzna nazirut ela lahafla. This is Rabbi Tarfon explain. Now, the reason some people say, why did they quote this instead of quoting our Mishnah, which said Rabbi Tarfon says none of them are a Nazir? It's the same thing. Because this Tosefta gives the reason. I already told you the reason when we learned the Mishnah, but if you hadn't known that, hadn't known this Tosefta, you wouldn't have known the reason why Rabbi Tarfon says no one's a Nazir. So what you gain by quoting the Tosefta is, he says it explicitly. What does that mean? The Torah says, Ki yafli lindor neder nazir lazir lashem. That's the pasuk. Ki yafli is you make an expression. And an expression, Rabbi Tarfon says, the only way you can be a Nazir is if you make a definitive expression of acceptance of Nazirut. And when you say, I'll be a Nazir if, and you don't know if it's true or not, right? If you say, I'll be a Nazir if I eat something, that's just a condition. That's fine. Because you intend to eat it. But if I make a declaration based on something we're not really sure whether it's right or not, because how do we know? Because you're convinced it's someone and I'm convinced it's somebody else. That's not an acceptance. That's more like a bet. And you can't take on Nazirut as a bet. It doesn't work that way, according to Rabbi Tarfon. And therefore, so far, all we've done for today so far is to say this line about if the guy never shows up on the scene and we don't know who it is, we can't ever identify them. He's not a Nazir, right? All those people are not going to be, none of them are going to be Nazirim. That clearly can't be Rabbi Tarfon, because all of that assumes that if we could identify the person, though one of them would be a Nazir, and Rabbi Tarfon doesn't think any of them are Nazir. So now we're left with Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. But like I said, the Gemara doesn't go to Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. The Gemara says, Ela Rabbi Yehuda de Krihu. It must be Rabbi Yehuda of the Kri case, the pile. Okay, that's the one I mentioned before, Ditanya, as we saw in Daf Chet. Hareini Nazir, and this is also in the Tosefta, although it appears in the Tosefta a bit of a different version. Hareini Nazir, Amanatche Bekrize Mea Kol. You say, I'm going to be a Nazir, right? If there's 100 core, that's a volume measurement in this pile. And halacho mitza'oshen ignavo shavad, you went to find it, right? We compared this to the jelly bean case, right? How many jelly beans in the jar? So it turns out then, right, as if the jelly bean spilled all over and got eaten, and then there's no way to find it. So now they have no way to know how much was actually in there or whether he's a Nazir or not. So what happens in that case? Rabbi Shimon osel, the Rabbi Yehuda matil. Rabbi Shimon forbids. Rabbi Shimon basically says you're a Nazir. Now, even though it doesn't say so here, the Tosefta actually says, the Rabbi Shimon says, you're a Nazir misapek, and exactly like we said in our Mishnah, if, right, what you say is, you say the following thing. If really there was Me'at Kor, I'm a Nazir based on my obligation. And if not, then I'm going to take on Nazirut b'tor nedavat as a voluntary thing. So that's Rabbi Shimon. But Rabbi Yehuda matil, he says, you're nothing. Why are you nothing? You might remember this from the beginning of our Masechet. Because Rabbi Yehuda doesn't think you could do this option of, either I'm a Nazir mivadai, right? Either I'm a Nazir by my obligation, or I'm going to take on voluntary Nazirut. And what does he say? If you're a Nazir from Safek, you can never get out of it because you can't bring korbanot for no reason. And therefore, he says you would never put yourself in a situation where you're going to put yourself where your Safek is going to make you worse than your vadai. So obviously, you only meant to make yourself a Nazir if you were going to find out for sure. But if you were going to be left in the Suffolk situation, which is going to make it worse because you'll never have a way to get out of it because you can't bring sacrifices to the temple for no reason. You can't shave off all your payot for no reason. But there's all sorts of issues. So he basically says you didn't intend to take on Nazirut in the event that it was going to be stolen and you would never have a way to find out. And therefore you're not a Nazir at all. So basically the Gemara now says, even if we held like Beit Hillel, let's say, where we said, if it comes out to be true, right? In other words, what did the Mishnah presume here? If it would come out to be true, then you would be a Nazir. But if you have no way to know the truth, then you're not a Nazir. That what Beit Hillel only told us, what if we know the truth? Beit Hillel didn't say, though, what if you're in a Suffolk situation? Who did deal with that? Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. And that's why we attribute this opinion to Rabbi Yehuda and not start going to Beit Hillel, because Beit Hillel never told us what to do in a Suffolk situation. Beit Hillel just told us in the Mishnah, when you find out who it is, whoever told the truth, and knew what the real answer was, they're going to be a Nazir. But he didn't talk about a Suffolk, and here this is a Suffolk situation. So therefore, we're going to end up, and that's why I wanted to point out, it's a little bit tricky, because they seem to be talking about the inference, but it's not just the inference, it's the combination of the fact that You're not going to be a Nazir. When he turns away and you never see him, he's not going to be a Nazir. That's really, in the end, what pushes us to say Rabbi Yehuda. The Tam Mishum Dirtia Ha'ate L'Kaman Rabbi Nazir was to get rid of Rabbi Tarfon. The fact that since if he were to show up, then we can assume that you would be a Nazir. That proves that this opinion clearly can't be Rabbi Tarfon. So the inference was to get rid of Rabbi Tarfon, but the law in the Mishnah itself was where we got led to Rabbi Yehuda. So now we have one last thing before we get to the next Mishnah, which is to explain Rabbi Shimon's approach, even though we kind of know it because we've learned it before, but they repeat and they explain to us Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Sabal, Kevandi Ilu Lo Nignav, Mahavu Be'mei Kol, Mahavi Nazir. In the pile of the wheat case, he says, maybe there was really 100 core of wheat in there. And then you would be a Nazir. So now, Hashtanami Havi Nazir, now that we have no way to determine whether or not there was me'akor, but you might actually be a Nazir, and therefore you have to be a Nazir out of Safek. Same thing here. Hachanami. If the person had shown up in front of us, the Adina Diploni, who we know exactly who it is, having Nazir, someone there would have been a Nazir, therefore Hashtanami having Nazir. Therefore, we have to treat you as if you're a Nazir now. So Rabbi Shimon is basically saying, just like in the Me'akor, or in this case, again, this is pretty obvious to us at this point, which is, since it could be you were right, and it could be you're a Nazir, again, going like Beit Hillel, whoever was right is the one who's going to be a Nazir, then when we get into a Safek situation and we're not sure if you were right or not because the person disappeared, then Rabbi Shimon says you basically have to become a Nazir out of Safek. But again, you do it in such a way that you save yourself not having to be a Nazir forever by saying either I'm taking upon myself my obligation, or if not, then I'll take a voluntary Nazirite period upon myself right now, which according to Rabbi Shimon, there's no problem to do that. Right? Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree with that approach, but Rabbi Shimon thinks so, and therefore he's a Nazir Misafek. So basically what we did so far is we identified that the Tana that disagrees with Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Yehuda, which again, it's pretty obvious from all we had learned before. We've seen a bunch of Mishnayot with this kind of thing, and that case of the core, the Me'akor, and therefore that's what we did. Now we're going to see a Mishnah that's similar to the previous case, but different. First, you have to know what a koi is. Okay, it's actually on the bookmarks for Nazir. So a koi is an animal. There's a whole debate about what exact animal it is in terms of, what we know of animals today, which one is the koi that they're talking about. There's a debate. I'm not going to get into exactly which animal it is, but there's a debate because we don't really know. There's a debate about whether this animal, it comes up in halacha all the time, whether this animal is a behema or a chaya. Behema is a domesticated animal, chaya is an undomesticated animal, which has all sorts of ramifications. I'll give you one of them. For example, we talked about the chaylev, because we've been talking about this recently. The chaylev of behemot cannot be eaten. So that's the forbidden fats, specifically of behemot, though, not of chayot. It's not forbidden for a chaya. So basically, if you have a koi, the chaylev of a koi is a safek. We don't know if it's forbidden or not, because we don't know if this is a domesticated animal or a non-domesticated animal. So now we have a situation where the koi safek comes into play as well. Ra'a et a koi. You see a koi. By the way, some people pronounce it kvi. There's different ways of pronouncing and knowing, right? Besides that they don't know what kind of animal it is, they don't even know how to pronounce the word. I'm going to go with koi. If you see a koi, ve'amal hareini nazir shezeh chaya. You basically say, I'm sure a koi is a chaya. Now, the difference between this and the previous case, already you can tell which is. The previous case, once we saw the person close up, we'd be able to identify who the real person is. In this case, we don't have a way to figure out whether a koi is a chaya or a behema or not. So that's problem number one. So he says, Hareini Nazir shezeh chaya, and then the next guy says, we're going to have 9 statements here. Okay, it's going to split into 6 and 3. Okay, last time we also had, last time we had 6 altogether. Hareini Nazir shezeh eno chaya. So the next person says, I'll be a Nazir if this is not a chaya. I'm sure that a koi is not a chaya. A chaya is an non-domesticated animal. Hareini Nazir shezeh behema. Hareini Nazir she'ein zeh behema. So numbers 3 and 4 said, I'm sure it's a domesticated animal. 4 says, I'm sure it's not a domesticated animal. Okay, 5 and 6. Hareini Nazir shezeh chaya ubehema. Hareini Nazir she'ein zeh lo chaya v'lo behema. I'm convinced that it's both a domesticated and a non-domesticated animal. The other one says, I'm convinced that it's neither a domesticated animal or a non-domesticated animal. By the way, some people think that koi is what we call a bria b'fnei atzma. It's in its own unique category. Doesn't fall into chaya or behem. So that would be this person. Now we have three more. What are the three more? We've dealt with every possible permutation. So now again, we have like last time. I'll be a Nazir if one of you is a Nazir. Number 8 says, I'll be a Nazir if none of you are Nazir. And the last person, I'll be a Nazir if all of you are Nazirim. Now, in this case, we do not have a three-way machlokes. Hare kulam Nazirim. All of them are Nazirim. Now, this sounds like Beit Shammai, because what did Beit Shammai say in the previous Mishnah? All of them are Nazirim, remember? Because he said this is just a way that they're taking upon themselves Nazirut. It would be very strange that a simple Mishnah was like Beit Shammai. So there's different explanations of this Mishnah. Some people say that, I'll redo the Rambam. The Rambam is very interesting. The Rambam says, when he quotes this halacha, he says in the Mishnah Torah, he says the following: why are kulam Nazirim? Mipnei shehakoi yesh bo drachim shaveh be'em l'chaya v'yesh bo drachim shaveh be'em l'behema. Because a koi in some ways is treated like a chaya, and in some ways is treated like a behema. And yesh bo drachim shaveh l'chaya l'behema, and in some ways is treated like both, and in some ways is treated like neither. So therefore, he basically says, since the koi has all these elements to it, they're all actually telling the truth. Because to a certain extent, in certain ways, we're going to treat them not like any. In certain ways, we're going to treat them like both. In certain ways, we're going to treat it like one or the other. So because of that, the Rambam basically says all of Nazirim, because they all said some statement of truth, which is very different than the previous Mishnah, because a person can't be one person and not that person all at the same time, whereas a koi actually could be. So that's an interesting way to read the Mishnah. Other people read the Mishnah saying that it's Beit Hillel according to Rabbi Shimon. And then you're missing the important part of the Mishnah, which is that, well, they're Nazirim out of Safek, and then they'd have to say this statement of, if this is true, what I said, then I'll be a Nazir by obligation. And if not, I'll be a Nazir by, by nidava, by voluntary offering. But that is missing from the Mishnah. But some people say it's obvious it's Beit Hillel, according to Rabbi Shimon, which is Beit Hillel, right? Is whoever's right as a Nazir. We don't know who's right. So basically, any one of them potentially might be right. And then you're going to be a Nazir Mesafek. Within that interpretation, becomes interesting because numbers 7, 8, and 9 are actually Nazir Vada. Why? Because the first 6, we don't know who's right. But already, when you get to the last 3, one says if one of them is right, well, definitely one of them is right. If none of them are right, also one of them is not right, right? If one of them is not a Nazir. And even though they're all Nazirim Misafek, but theoretically one doesn't need to be a Nazir. And the one who says they're all Nazirim, well, in the end, they're all Nazirim out of Safek. So that makes the last one a Vadei Nazir, because everyone is actually a Nazir, at least out of doubt. So I know that sounds a little complicated, but this is a way to understand. Okay, so now Tanei Chada Tish'a Nazirim. One Braita says 9 Nazirim, which is basically what we just said, right? That you could have a case where all 9 of these people are Nazirim, and that's what we just explained. So there's a Braita that basically talks about our Mishnah in the sense that there's 9 different people, like we said. But Tanya Idach, there's a different Braita that says Tesha Naziruyot. One person in this way could take upon 9 types, 9 30-day segments of Nazirut, 9 terms. So Bishlama Tisha Nazirim, okay, I get the 9 Nazirim. How so? Tigon to have a gavra tfei di'ik pisfazil be. You had, right, you kept having more and more people, and each one said the following, and exactly how we described our Mishnah. And they're all kind of going on, right, this court. But how could you have 9 terms of Nazirut in this way of one person who said all 9 things? I could see that a person could say, I'll be a Nazir if this is a Chaya. I'll be a Nazir if this isn't a Chaya. I'll be a Nazir if this, right? You could theoretically say all those things, which basically means I'll be a Nazir any which way you look at it. But that would be 6 terms. That wouldn't be 9. How could he say then, I'll be a Nazir if one of you is a Nazir? I'll be a Nazir if neither one of you is a Nazir. He's talking about himself, and it can't possibly be that he is or he isn't. And as he is obviously a Nazir, it doesn't make any sense. So they say, but the last 3, how are you going to have that case? So Amar Rav Sheshet, Kigon de Amal, Hareini Nazir, Unizirut Hakol Alai. What happened? You had other people say, I'm a Nazir if it's Chaya, I'm a Nazir if it's a Behema, I'm a Nazir, right? And they all said that. And then I came along, let's say, after 6 people said all those 6 statements, and I said, I'm going to be a Nazir if one of them is a Nazir. I'm going to be a Nazir if neither of them is Nazir. I'm going to be a Nazir if all of them are Nazirim. And then I say, and I'm going to take upon myself all of their Naziruyot upon me. So then I take on their 6 cycles, their 6 terms, and the extra 3 that I said. So that's a way you could get to 9, creative. And with that, Hadran alach beit Shammai, we finished the chapter. So quick summary of what we did today so far. We still have more to go. But we basically have the Mishnah, which had said, Hirti alach olav eino Nazir, and then Rabbi Shimon disagreed. We identified that with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in the core case that we saw there, in the pile. And then we had the koi case, where it seemed very similar to our Mishnah, but it turned out the law was different, and we saw 3 different ways of interpreting. Either it's exclusively Beit Shammai, which everybody really contradicts, because how could you have a Mishnah that's just simply Beit Shammai? We don't generally hold it Beit Shammai. And then we gave 2 other interpretations of the Rambam and others. So it's in Tosfot about whether we view it as Beit Hillel according to Rabbi Shimon, or we view it as the way the Rambam said, which is they're actually all correct, because to a certain extent, the koi has all of those and none of those elements in it. And then we said there's 2 ways to read this Mishnah. You could have this case with 9 separate people, and you could have it with 1 person taking on 9 terms, which in the end we described would have to be 6 people and 1 person taking on 9 terms, because there's no other real way to get to there. Now we get to how you get lashes for eating grapes. We're going to talk about the grapes and the wine and all that, and shiurim, requisite amounts, what's the requisite amount, what counts toward that requisite amount, etc. So let's start with the Mishnah, and then we'll move to the verses in the Torah, and then we'll come back to the Mishnah. The topic sentence, not really the topic sentence, because right now they're going to say there's 3 types of forbidden things in Nazir: Tuma, becoming impure to a dead body; Tiglachat, shaving your hair, or cutting your hair; and Hayotze min hagefen, and anything that comes out from gefen, from vines, right, from grapes. Okay, now the whole Mishnah is going to deal now with just grapes. That's why I said it's not a fair topic sentence, because now it's going to go into the grape issue. Anything that comes from the vine combines together. Okay, so first let's stop for 1 quick minute, and we'll read the verses in the Torah. If you have a real Gemara in front of you, the Psukim are on the side in the Torah or on Amud Bet. Miyayin v'shechar yazil. You should stay away from wine and beer, even though in the end we learned that shechar is not really beer, it's really wine. Chometz yayin v'chometz shechar, so vinegar that comes from grapes, basically. Lo yishteh, you can't. So not only wine, also vinegar. V'chol mishrat anavim lo yishteh. Anything soaked in wine. Okay, like you have. We'll get to the case of bread that had wine, was wine-soaked bread. Lo yishteh. Va'anavim lechim v'yiveshim lo yochal. And you can't eat grapes, not regular grapes, fresh grapes, or dried grapes. Kol yemei nizro michol asher yaseh migefen hayayin. All the days of your nizirut, from anything that's made from the vine, mechartzanim va'ad zag, from the chartzanim until the zag. We're going to have to translate what these are, but let's call it, we're going to have this a machloket tanaim. What is chartzanim and what is zag? They agree about the 2 things. It's just a matter of which word means what. But we'll go from the pits to the grape seeds, the grape peels, lo yochal. Okay, so now if you notice, I'm going to get to this toward the end of the daf, it was very specific, and it told you a whole long list of every single item, right? It gave you the yayin, the chometz, the dry, the non-dry, the soaked, all that. Then it gave this generalization. If you know the drashot in the Torah, you already know where this is going, right? It's going to be like a prat, a klal, and then a prat. Okay, then it gets very specific again, and it starts talking about the grape seeds and the grape or the grape pits and the grape peels. So, and you see incredible detail into what they say. So now the Gemara is going to say the following: anything that comes out of the yayin, the gefen, from the vine, mitzdarfim zeim zeh, they combine together. Meaning, if you need to get to a kazayit and you ate not a whole kazayit of grapes, but you ate some grapes, some pits, some peels, that will add up to a kazayit. Ve'en chayav ad sheyochal min ha'anavim kazayit. But you're only going to be obligated for a kazayit. Now, we didn't say kazayit yet, okay? Kazayit is the olive bulk. That's a general shiur. So what it's telling you is that really you should start from the end. You need a kazayit to be obligated, lashes, but you can make a kazayit combined with a bunch of different parts of the grape, okay? You don't need just grapes. Mishnah Rishona omeret. Now we seem to be moving to Amud, first of all, and we're also moving to wine. This is a difference usually in the shiur for liquids and shiur for solids. Usually the shiur for liquids is revi'it, a quarter of a log, and the shiur for solids is a kazan. Some people combine them and say that it's really, if you took a revi'it and you made it solid, it would be a kazayit size, and that they're really one and the same. That's one way to read this. Some people read this as it's a different shiur, and you'll see why, because then someone might argue with that. So we're going to have a number of cases today, often Tanaim, and when we see debates, they usually disagree about one point. We're going to see a bunch of points here where it seems, at least according to some interpretations, they differ on two issues. Makes it a little more complicated to understand, but we'll see. So the first Mishnah means like an earlier time in the Mishnah, they thought, because remember, the Mishnah spanned a certain amount of time. It started, depends where you say it started, but it's certainly, about 200 years, from 0 to 200, even a bit earlier, or something a little bit later. Anyway, Mishnah Rishona omeret, ad sheyishteh revi'it yain. So the first earlier part, or the earlier version, was that you needed to drink a revi'it of wine in order to be obligated for drinking. Rabbi Akiva Omer, now here there's a question, does he disagree about the kezayit revi'it thing? Or does he end about something else? Or does he just agree about the something else? So let's see what he says, and then we'll discuss the two options. So after this Mishnah Rishonah, later came Rabbi Akiva, and he changed it, and he said, Afilu sharat pito b'yayin. Even if you soaked your bread in wine, v'yesh ba kedei litzarech kezayit chayah. If you have a kezayit of the wine mixed with the bread, so you're eating bread in the shiur of a kezayit, in it is wine, but there's not a revi'it of wine in it. So generally, you wouldn't be obligated for that. He says, and this is called in halachic language, heter mitzarech li'isur, that when you have heter and isur mixed together and you eat it, that isur the measurement becomes the heter and the isur together. So if you have a kezayit of bread that's soaked with wine, even though there's not a revi'it of wine in it, then you're going to be obligated anyway. So some people think that he's just arguing about this point and pointing out something that the Mishnah Rishonah didn't relate to, which is if there's wine mixed into a solid, then we're going to go by the shiur of a kezayit of the solid, and you don't need a revi'it of wine. Some people say that he's actually disagreeing and also about that you need a kezayit of wine, not a revi'it, and therefore we're going to end up saying, number one, he says you need a kezayit, and number two, you can measure that kezayit with heter and isur together. And yes, what you're asking is, it's because you're eating it together, it becomes one item basically, and you're eating a kezayit of forbidden item, right? If it was batel, that would be something else. If it was just a little drop of wine, then it wouldn't count. But it would have to be enough wine that's not regular laws of application, and therefore it would be forbidden. So again, debate about whether Rabbi Akiva disagrees about one point, just about heter mitzarech li'isur, which the Mishnah Rishonah didn't mention, or is he disagreeing with the Mishnah Rishonah entirely and thinks it's not a revi'it, it's a kezayit of wine? And now we're going to have another machlok. The first opinion here says, if you eat a kezayit, before you didn't eat enough of a kezayit of any one of them, right? You ate the pits, and you ate the seed, the skins, and you ate a little bit of grape, and all together you ended up with the shiur of a kezayit. But what if you ate a whole kezayit whole olive bulk of wine, of grapes, and then you ate the seeds, a kezayit's worth, and then you ate the skins, a kezayit's worth? So, according to Tanakama here, you'd be chayav separate sets of lashes for each kezayit, because notice in the pasuk they're all listed separately. So, while they could combine if you don't have enough of one, but once you have enough of one, that's its own separate isur, and then you ate another one, that's its own separate. And then you get lashes for all of them. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, now again, he's disagreeing about something, but he seems to disagree about two things. He says, the pasuk says, me chartzanim ve'ad zag, combines the chartzanim and the zag, and notice chartzanim is plural, zag is singular. So he says it must be that you need to eat 2 chartzanim. Let's just assume most people think he's going by chartzanim are the pits. You eat 2 grape pits and 1 zag. Number 1, you're already obligated because that's the Torah, chartzanim to zag. So you ate 2 pits and 1 skin or peel of a grape. you're now obligated, even though, imagine the size, it's clearly not an olive bulb. So he doesn't think that it's an olive bulb, okay? So he says, you eat 2 seeds and 1 grape skin, you're obligated even though you don't have a kazayit. That's number 1. But number 2, he's saying, you're not going to be obligated, according to the Tanakama, if you eat a zag, just the grape skins of a kazayit's worth of grape skins, you're not obligated, according to him. Or if you eat grape seeds, a kazayit's worth, you're not obligated. You're only going to be obligated if you eat them together, because that's what the verse said. From chartzanim to zag, that means you have to eat them both together in order to be obligated of that part. So they, again, disagreement about 2 different things here. Number 1, he doesn't even require a kazayit. Number 2, he thinks that you have to actually eat them together and that you need 2 seeds. Without 2 seeds, you're not going to be, right? You need 2 seeds and the skin in order to be obligated. Next, now we have this debate I mentioned. Eluhem chartzanim ve'eluhem zagim. By the way, you might notice this already. This Mishnah is a bit of an atypical Mishnah. First of all, it seems a little bit unclear in many ways. Usually Mishnayot are pretty clear and straightforward, although obviously we always have debates about how to understand Mishnayot. This one is particularly unclear because it seems like everyone's arguing about different things, right? They're going head to head, but they're not exactly saying the same thing, right? They're not explicit in exactly what they're disagreeing about, and each one seems to disagree on 2 points and not just 1 point, which is, again, a little bit rare. Okay, now we want to know what are chatzanim and what are zagim. Hachartzanim, according to Tanakama, chartzanim elu, it's Rabbi Yehuda. In a minute, we'll see. Hachartzanim elu hachitzonim. The chartzanim are not, as I said before, the seeds. They're actually the skins, the peel of the grape. Hazagim elu apnimim, and the zagim are the seeds. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Omer shelo tit'eh. He says, here I'm going to give you a mnemonic so you don't forget it. Tizog shel behema. It's like the bell that the animals wear around their necks. The outer part is called, okay, this might not be easy for you to remember because you don't know this, but the outer part, hachitzon, is the zog. So the outer part of the bell, right? The bell is made up of this thing inside and an outer part, right? And then it clangs against it. So the chitzon is the zog and the pnimi is the imbal. The inner part is called the imbal. That's the part that rings the clapper. Thank you. Couldn't think of the word. And the chitzon, the outer part, is the zog. So that's the outer part is the zog. That reminds you that zag is the outer part and the chartzanim are the inner part. Which also makes sense with what earlier we said, because chartzanim are in plural in the Torah. If you're going to think of plural things, we have 1 grape with 1 skin around it and multiple seeds. So it makes more sense to talk about the seeds are the plural one in the Torah, and the zag is the singular, which is the skin, the outer part. So now we have 2 ways to remember it. We also gave us 1. Now we have the other, and right, we have these 2 approaches about how to define it, and we actually hold like Rabbi Yossi. Now the Mishnah is going to start with Shloshaminim asurim b'nazir hatumah, etc. And now they're going to derive something from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, and then immediately say, our Mishnah obviously disagrees with somebody else. Our Mishnah said, everything that comes out of the vine combines. Now, it must be only talking about things that come out, the bloom from the bud from there. Gefen atzmo lo. But what part is not included? All of the leaves, right? We know we eat grape leaves, but people make all sorts of things with grape leaves. The leaves are not forbidden for the Nazir, and neither are the tendrils, which are also edible. In which case, because it says everything that comes out of the gefen, that's not coming out of the vine. Manitin de loka Rabbi Eliezer. It must be our Mishnah like Rabbi Eliezer. Ditanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer afilu alim belulavim b'mashma. Rabbi Eliezer says not only everything that comes out of the gefen, but also the vine itself, the leaves and the tendrils. So we have this assumption that our Mishnah seems to contradict Rabbi Eliezer, okay, which seems to not go according to his opinion. Some people have the exact same conclusion, but they learn it from not the word that we derived it from, the word that we derived it from the Mishnah, kol yotzei min hagefen, anything that comes out of the gefen combines together, but the next line, ve'ein chayav ad she'ochal min ha'anavim kazayit. You're only obligated when you eat from the grapes a kazayit, to which they're going to infer the same thing. Ikid amri la seifa. Some people say they learn it from the next line. Eino chayav ad she'ochal min ha'anavim kazayit, which means from min ha'anavim in. It has to be actually from the grapes themselves, and not from the grape leaves, right? Mehagefen atzmo lo, but not from the vine itself. So either which way, matnitin, right? And then in this case, they derive matnitin de loka Rabbi Eliezer, de Tanya Rabbi Eliezer, Omer afilu alim v'lu lavim b'mashma. So we have two lines in our Mishnah that you can derive it from. Either which way, we derive the same thing if they disagree. Now we want to know, and this is going to take us to the end of our daf, b'mai kamiflage. What's the root of the machlok? Rabbi Eliezer darash, ribuye umiute, Rabbanan darash, klale uprate. Now we're going to get a little confusing. Riboy and miut and klal and prat are two different methodologies of darshaning the Torah. They're all pretty similar. One is saying generalization and a specification, and the other one saying generalization and a specification. Okay, so the wording is a little bit different, but it means a different method. What's the difference in the method? Riboy and miut is when you have, let's say, a generalization, and then you get more specific. What we're going to say is that a riboy miut is less specific in the end. In other words, we're going to say, yes, the Torah was general and it was specific, but the specifics can be more wider than just that specific thing. We have a klal prat generally. Let's just take a basic klal and prat. If you have a generalization, it says something like a broad term, all blah, 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 and then it says something very specific. It gives an example. Only things that are just like the example are included. So when you have a riboy and a miut, the miut does take out some things, but much more general. More is going to be included. It doesn't have to be exactly like the prat, like the detail. It can be generally like. Whereas if you have a klal prat, usually we're going to say if there's a generalization, then you get specific, it's going to be very specified to anything it's going to include something that's like the prat, like the specific thing, but only if it's really like the prat. So that's the general overall difference between them. But again, just like a whole bunch of things in today's daf, we're going to see that they actually differ on how to darshan this pasuk. Because if you remember, we saw there was details, right? There was the yayin and the chometz and all that. And then there was this everything from the geffen. And then it went specific again, chartzanim ba'adzag. So it's really not just a regular klal prat. It's a prat, klal, prat. Okay, which is kind of rare. Usually you have klal, prat, klal. Okay, general, specific, general. This is a specific, general, specific. Another difference between them is that when we go on the klalu prat track, we're going to darshan prat, klal, prat, the three parts of the pasuk, the two pasukim. The riboy miut track, the person who holds that, not only is going on the riboy miut, which is including more things, but also they're going to ignore the chartzanim va'adzag. They're not going to darshan it at all. So they're only going to end up with a miut and a riboy. And they're not going to have a miut at the end. They're just not going to darshan that. We're going to have to figure out why don't they darshan that. That's tomorrow. So right now we're going to start with the drasha. Rabbi Eliezer darish riboy umiute. Rabbanan darish klali prat. Okay, we already know Rabbi Eliezer includes more things, so he obviously goes on the riboy miut track, which is more inclusive. And the rabbis who are more specific darshan klali prat. Rabbi Eliezer darish riboy miute. How so? Miyayin b'shechar yazir. That's already specific. Mikol asher yaseh migefen hayayin. Then it's a generalization, everything that comes from the geffen, as opposed to all the specifics they mentioned before. Riba, mi-8, right? So again, we have sorry, I didn't read that well. Mi'ayin v'shechar yazir is mi-8. Then we have mikol asher yaseh migefen hayayin is riboy. And then we have mi-8 v'riba, riba hakol. If you have a miut and a riboy, what happens? The riboy is coming to say we include everything. My riba kol mile. So what did we include? By starting specific and then getting general, it must mean it's including everything. But then it says, well, there still is the miut. You can't ignore the specifics. So my mi'et shabishta. Mi'et shabishta means we excluded the hard branches that are inedible. Okay? That's the part that it was mi'et. So again, you're going to be mima'et something. You can't ignore the miut that's specific, but it's only coming to exclude the very, something that's inedible. By the way, I see you wrote that it's not in the Yugimel Midot. Of course it's not in the Yugimel Midot, because if you darshan klal prats, then you don't darshan riboy miuts, because it's two different methodologies of darshaning the Torah. One is using klal prat methodology, and one is using riboy miut methodology. And this is different schools of thought about how to darshan the Torah. When things are specified after there's a generalization, or maybe before there's a generalization, again, it really depends on the order, but is it coming to be very specific? That's the klal prat versus much less specific. So now, Rabbanan darshe klal prat. Miyayim b'shechar yazir prat. So now I said there's two things. Number one, it's the klal uprat methodology. Number two, he's going to do prat, klal, prat, as opposed to just having two things. He's going to have the three. Okay, whereas the first drasha really ignored the chartzanim v'adzag at the end there. So miyayim b'shechar yazir is prat. Mikol asher yaseh migefen hayayin is klal, right? Then it comes to be general. Mechartzanim v'adzag chazar v'parat. So then it became specific again. Prat uklal uprat. When you have those three, yatadan elakena prat. It's coming to teach you. It's only like the details. So what's unique about the details here? Mahaprat miforash pri upsolet pri. The pratim, which only later we're going to see how we know this, but the pratim that are discussed are the pri itself, right? The anavim. Upsolet pri, which we'll see later in the Gemara, is the vinegar. That's rotten pri, right? Bad that comes from the pri. In the end isn't bad, it's vinegar, but it's obviously wine that goes bad. Av kol pri upsolet pri. So now that we have those are the details, it's going to be anything that's a pri and the psolet of a pri, which we're going to have to say later, what is that including? What's anything that's like the pri and what's the psolet pri? We'll get back to it. Ima haprat miforash pri gamur. So now the Gemara is going to ask the following question on this drasha. Okay, the drasha is over. If the prat is miforash pri gamur, av kol pri gamur. Amarta im ken ma'iniach lecha katuv b'mashma'o shelo amaro. If the pri is coming to include other things that are part of the pri, but the Torah already, and that's why I read you that pasuk in the beginning, specified every possible thing. What else could be the pri that's not included in the pasuk? Anavim lachim v'yeveshim haktive, right? Fresh and dried grapes are listed. Yain b'chometz, wine and vinegar, haktive. They're already written in the pasuk. So now, and then what they were trying to say is, sorry, I kind of missed the question, which is, what they want to say is, why are you saying pri and psolet pri? Why don't you just say the prat is just the pri? And then it has to be really like the pri and not like the psolet. To which they say, ima prat miforash pri gamur, maybe it should only be pri gamur and not other things. To which they say, since it already specified all these things, right? It must mean it must be that it needs to include more things, because otherwise the drasha has to include something that's not included in the pasuk. So if you would say it's just anything that's like the pri or comes from the pri, then you would have already come. What would you have said? Oh, it must include even if they're dried, even if it turns to vinegar. But that already is mentioned in the pasuk. You don't need a drasha for that. The drasha must be including something extra. And in other words, what they were saying basically, if you want to limit, why don't you really limit? To which they say, you don't need a drasha to limit to that, to tell you all those, because those are listed explicitly in the pasukim, so you have to go a little bit farther. So now they continue. If they already included all these things, why did they need to say mechartzanim v'adzag? That seems unnecessary. In other words, if you just had the prat and the klal, you would already know it's only like the prat. What did chartzanim v'adzag add? It really didn't add anything. To which they're going to say, lomar lecha, it's to teach you how to do these types of drasha. Normally, it's a klal uprat. The rules are klal uprat, if you have a generalization, and then you have a specific. Okay, then it's only going to be like the prat. But if you have a prat and then a klal, normally, not like ours, where there's a prat after. If you have a klal prat, first you start specific, then you get general, then that's going to be a more open drasha, because you can't just say it's only like the prat, because why did they, right? The klal must be adding to include something in additional to the specific case. Unless it goes back to the prat. So if you have a normal, okay, let's just go through the basics. Klal prat means once you're general, but then you get specific, it's only like the specific. But if you start with a prat and then a klal, you're basically saying, I want to get wider. I'm going to add more things. But if you end up with a prat at the end, then no. So this is teaching you that a regular prat through klal would actually be more inclusive. But because this ends with a prat, it then makes it much more limited. And that's what's coming to teach you the rules by klal prat, so that you know that if it was just a prat in klal, it would actually be wider. Okay, so that you know in other places, if it just has prat klal and it doesn't go back and get more specific again, like in our case, the chartzanim v'adzag, it did get more specific, then you're going to have a wider explanation. Okay, last part for today. Amar ma prat meforash pri upsola pri afko pri upsola pri. I told you we're going to have to define this part of the drasha. Pri are inve, that we know, is anavim, right? Obviously the grape. Psole pri maihi, what's that? I already told you, chometz, the vinegar. So now what's it including? The pri is including something, and the psole pri is including. So what's it including? Af kol pri, when it says even anything that's like it, maihi, guharki. These are unripe grapes. If you eat the fruit itself, but it's unripe, you're going to be forbidden as well. You'll get lashes. Af kol dipsole pri maihi. So what's this? Things that are besides the chometz. What else is psole pri? Amarav kahana leituye inve dichlin. Talking about grapes that have worm-infested grapes. Those also, if you ate them, pretty disgusting, but if you ate them, you would be liable. Last thing for today, the adzag amaravina latuye debena benayim. Why does it say mechartzanim ve'adzag? It should have said chartzanim v'zag. Why did it say from the chartzan until the zag? What they want to include is the fruit that gets stuck kind of on the skin. It's in between the skin and the fruit itself. And if you peel off the skin, sometimes you end up with pulp. Perhaps it's the pulp, or it's some sort of part that's stuck on the skin itself. So we call that the pulp. So that's what it's including. Okay, we're going to stop here. I'll tell you why we're stopping here. First of all, we're past time. Number two, what we're going to do from here to the end of the daf is just quote what we just read in the drasha itself, and then we're going to ask a question on that. So now we're going to say, or actually it was what the Gemara said. It was a quote, that long quote from the Gemara. Why do we assume, right? What the pasuk already said this, it already said that, it already said that. What is it coming to include? So anyway, they're just going to quote that, and then they're going to start on tomorrow's daf questioning it. So we're going to stop here, and that's it for today. So quick review, even though we're a little past time. I'm not going to review before the end of the chapter because we already reviewed that, but we had the three isurim. Then we had all these debates about, are they mitzaref together, right? You can have them together, and you need a kazayit. Then we went in, that wasn't a debate actually. Then we went into the wine. Is it the same shiur? Is it a different shiur? Is hester mitzaref l'isur or not? Then we saw, right, can you combine if you have the bread and the kazayit of bread, does that work? Then we had each one is its own, if you ate a kazayit of each one. Or versus Rabbi Lazar ben Nazir, you said you have to eat chartzanim and zag together, and you need 2 chartzanim and 1 zag, otherwise you're not doing what it says in the Torah. And those were another debate. Then we had what's chartzan, what's zag, a debate about that. And then we went into inferring from the Mishnah that our Mishnah doesn't hold like Rabbi Eliezer. And then we basically said, what's the machloket Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis based on? And it was based on this type of drashot. And then we went more into the rabbi's drashah, the klal, project klal, trying to understand it better. What are the different parts of what he's discussing? And why did he assume that we can make a drasha on this? And it was because all these other things were mentioned in the pasuk. So we must expand it a little bit more, not just to include the pri, but also the psolet pri. Okay, that's it for today. And we'll pick up from here tomorrow. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone.